Everyone, it's Pastor Doug with Guidestone.Church. I hope you're doing good today. We have reached Tuesday and in Holy Week, and as we follow along in kind of the path from Palm Sunday to Easter Sunday, Tuesday is a really interesting day as Jesus begins to talk about some things and in Scripture, and he uses this time to kind of share some not so good news with the people that are listening about what's coming for Israel. And it has to be a challenge to a lot of the people that followed him as things begin to get more confusing after Jesus came in riding what they thought would be a triumphant sort of battle cry as Jesus came in to lead his people into a new era, and this new era they thought again was a time where they were going to be made to be the ruling class. And as you think about that and the expectations that might have been a part of what was going on, it's no wonder that we find the story of Judas on Tuesday. And Judas is such an interesting character, the person that betrays Jesus, and that's kind of the story that we run into today, the beginning of that and what that looks like and how that's beginning to take place. And so I just wanted to read to you this part in the passage of Scripture today where it talks about that. And it says in Luke chapter 22, starting with verse 1, "Now the festival of unleavened bread, called the Passover, was approaching, and the chief priests and teachers of the law were looking for some way to get rid of Jesus, for they were afraid of the people. Then Satan entered Judas, called Iscariot, one of the 12. And Judas went to the chief priests and the officers of the temple guard and discussed with them how he might betray Jesus. They were delighted and agreed to give him money. He consented and watched for an opportunity to hand Jesus over to them when no crowd was present." Now, there's a lot of things that we could talk about here and why Judas betrayed Jesus. You know, was it just for the money? We certainly know that he had some kind of issue with money because he was the money keeper for Jesus, and so we saw that he had taken some of that money for himself, and so he had stolen from that pot of money. We also know that Judas, or there's no recorded evidence of Judas calling Jesus Lord. Maybe Judas had questions about who Jesus was and what he was going to do there. Maybe there was a little distrust in Jesus from the beginning. Maybe he was just simply trying to hitch his wagon to the right vehicle because Jesus, he thought, might overthrow the ruling class. And if he did, then Judas would have been primed as one of Jesus' disciples to be one of the people in charge. Of course, that kind of evidence shows up as he goes to try to make right or make good with the other leaders, and he goes in to the temple courts and begins to try to negotiate with them about how to get Jesus while no crowds were around. And of course, that was important too. When the crowds were around, they were listening to Jesus still at this point. And the rulers, the leaders of the Jewish people at the time, they knew that they could not overthrow Jesus or do anything to speak out against him because the crowds were on his side. But Jesus starts saying things about how this group of people would come to ruin. And this is called the Olivet Discourse. And certainly this would have been confusing and maybe even confirming for Judas that this was not the man that they thought he was. Jesus was not who they thought he was. And he was doing different things than they thought he should do or thought he would do. And as Jesus began to tell of some of the destruction of those people, they certainly would not have liked that. And so, in an instant, they were kind of thrown off by how Jesus was talking. Instead of saying, "I'm a conqueror," he said, "We are going to be conquered." And of course, as you know, if you follow the story forward, there was great heartache and great destruction. So here we have Judas, who goes in and makes friends with the rulers of the Jewish community. What was he doing that for? Again, was it for the money? Was it to get himself right? We don't know for sure, but one of the things we do know is that after he betrayed Jesus, which is coming in a few days, and I hate to jump ahead, but after he betrayed Jesus, Judas really had a tough time of it. There was angst, there was mourning, there was sorrow. He knew even if he didn't believe that Jesus was who he says he was, he had betrayed an innocent man. And we're not for sure if Judas even knew that they were going to try to kill him, but we did know that he collected money for the information. He was an inside informant for those leaders. And so we know that this ate at him. At some level, Judas knew that this was not something that he should have done. In fact, he goes back and returns the money and says that he has betrayed innocent blood. Now, I think this is kind of how the enemy works, and I wanted to talk to you a little bit about that, because when we think about this one thing, and especially as we're going through Holy Week, as we think about sin, sometimes we like to put ourselves in the stories of Scripture. And my question today is, can we identify with Judas? And I think the answer is yes, because oftentimes when we find ourselves going our own way and not trusting God, we feel pretty good and feel pretty confident in what we believe about what is taking place. When we sin, often we find ourselves feeling confirmed in doing what we think we are supposed to do. And the reason for that is we're affirmed by outside influences. We're affirmed by things that are of this world, things that are temporary. When those things begin to happen, we start to think that maybe this is the right way, that God certainly wouldn't call us a different way. And so we find ourselves in a very precarious position when we trust our own wisdom over the wisdom of God. And I think this is where Judas found himself, trusting in his own wisdom. Certainly, this can't be the Messiah that we've been looking for, because we've been looking for a conqueror. And yet Jesus was the Messiah, and he was just different than what they had expected. And if he was different than what they had expected, oftentimes we are like Judas. We're like, oh, well, that can't be. Instead of us changing and becoming more Christ-like, we want Christ to change to become more of what we want. And this is how the enemy works. I think in a lot of places where we find ourselves falling short, where we find ourselves in sin, and I think that that's a challenge for us today, because the enemy likes to minimize sin ahead of time. As I talked with my young adult group last night, our connection group, I found myself reminiscing about one thing that my mom had said to me many years ago. And she said, the enemy likes to minimize sin ahead of time and maximize it afterwards. See who you really are. See how you're not everything that you should be. See how you've done something wrong. And the enemy likes to press guilt in after the fact, after you've done something wrong. And so, it's not that big a deal. It's not going to matter that much. This is what the enemy says beforehand, or and then after the fact. Oh, you are so unworthy. I can't believe you would do that. And certainly Judas was feeling that guilt, to the point where in Matthew's gospel we see him hanging himself. And that is a challenge to all of us. In the first place, not to get so wrapped up in doing what we think is best, but following God. And then once sin takes place, how does God act differently than the enemy? Certainly God maximizes the sin beforehand, and this is sometimes what we feel as confining. We feel like God is keeping us from being everything that we can be, or what we want to be, or having what we want to have. And yet, after the fact, God minimizes sin through his grace. And I know that's a hard thing to comprehend, but the truth is that if any of us got what we deserved, it would certainly lead to our demise, internal death, mental death, emotional death, relational death, maybe even physical death. But the truth is that when we find ourselves in a sinful pattern, that it does break it does break us down. It leads to some sort of death or brings death into our lives in some capacity. And so my hope is that you understand that God is not trying to keep you from doing things that you shouldn't do or that you should do. God is trying to keep keep you from doing things that you shouldn't do, things that lead to death. If you follow God, it leads to life. And then if you understand too your humanness, and when those things do happen and when you fail, hopefully instead of running from God or allowing the enemy to speak into your life and try to convince you that you're worthless or that you need to be consumed by guilt, that you can find the gracious hand of God reaching out to you. That's my hope for you today. And I wonder if we could practice some sort of faithful movement as we kind of think about what's going to happen over the next week. Obviously, we live in hindsight of the resurrection. When we look back, we get to see that Christ has already risen. And so even though we're talking about Holy Week and even though we're talking about sin, we also know that there has been a resurrection and that we don't have to live in death. And so my question to you would be, what is it that keeps you from experiencing the life that God has for you? Is it something on the front end that you feel like God is keeping you from something that you want? Is it guilt over the past? Is it something that's keeping you focused on something that happened? Some of us are in both circumstances where there's something that we want or that we feel like we need that God is not allowing us to have. And on the flip side, looking back at our lives and we find ourselves feeling guilty or feeling unworthy. And yet God looks at us through the lens of Jesus Christ and his sacrifice on the cross. He looks at us and he sees restored. He sees worth. He sees value. God looks at us and he sees his son, Jesus Christ, because we're covered in his blood. I wonder if we could take that into this week. I wonder if there's something that we could do to kind of symbolize the truth of who we are and who our value is, what our value truly is. And my hope is that as we do this together, that we will begin to share life with other people. So I'd like for you to do something this week. I'd like for you to take an inventory of things that are keeping you from from really understanding your value. Write it down. Here's what I want you to do. I want you to get a journal of some sort or a piece of paper and just write down, is there something that I feel like God is keeping me from? If I were to follow God, would I feel like he's keeping me from something that I need or that I want? And then on a second part, you could ask this question: what is something that I've done in the past that is keeping me from experiencing all that God has for me? Is there something that I'm feeling guilty about? Is there something that I'm feeling anxious about? And then once you do that, I want you to kind of take that piece of paper and I want you to crumple it up or throw it in the trash or burn it in a fireplace or something along those lines, symbolically saying, God, you can have my future and you can have my past and I will follow you. I don't want you to get caught up thinking about things that God is keeping you from, because those things will keep you from experiencing the full life and the victory that God has for you. And I don't want you to be bogged down by the things that have been in your past. I want you to be free to live the victorious life that's found in Jesus. And so let's do that together. Let's take those things that we think we need, that we think we want, and let's put those down on a piece of paper. Let's take those things that we've done in the past and let's write those out. And then let's free ourselves of those things and allow God's forgiveness for the past and his life for the future, his hope for the future. Let's let that enter into our lives too, okay? Hey, I'm looking forward to seeing you, and I hope that you'll do this with us as we go through Holy Week. I'll be with you again tomorrow on Wednesday, and we'll continue this journey through from Palm Sunday to Resurrection Sunday. Hey, I love you. Looking forward to being with you soon. Have a great day. Bye.